Imagine sitting in a courtroom, the air thick with tension. As a judge, a figure meant to embody fairness and justice, let slip a comment so shocking, so blatantly racist, that the entire room falls silent. This isn't a scene from a movie or a dramatized TV show. This is real life. And for one black woman, it was a moment that would change everything. What started as a routine day in court turned into a jaw-dropping showdown, where the tables were flipped in the most unexpected way. By the end of it, the judge wasn't the one handing down a sentence. He was the one being led away in handcuffs. How did it all unfold? Let's rewind to the beginning. The story centers around a young black woman named Tasha, a single mother of two who had been fighting an uphill battle against a system that often feels stacked against people who look like her. Tasha had been wrongfully accused of a minor traffic violation, one that she insisted was a misunderstanding. But instead of being heard, she was met with dismissive attitudes and bureaucratic red tape. Determined to clear her name, she showed up to court that day, prepared to plead her case. What she didn't expect was to be met with outright hostility from the very person who was supposed to ensure justice was served, Judge Harold Grayson. Judge Grayson was a man who had been on the bench for over 2 decades. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor, he had a reputation for being tough but fair, or so people thought. As Tasha stood before him, nervously explaining her situation, she noticed the judge's expression shift. His eyes narrowed, and his tone grew colder with every word she spoke. Then it happened. In a moment that would later be described as unbelievable by witnesses, Judge Grayson made a comment that stopped the room dead in its tracks. "People like you," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "always find a way to play the victim." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Tasha felt her stomach drop. Did he really just say that? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. But before anyone could fully process what had just happened, Tasha did something no one saw coming. She stood her ground. With a calm but firm voice, she called out the judge's blatant bias, demanding to know how she could possibly expect a fair trial under such circumstances. Her courage sparked something in the room. A few people began to clap, while others looked on in stunned silence. Judge Grayson, visibly flustered, tried to regain control of the situation, but the damage was done. The moment had been captured on camera, and it was only a matter of time before it went viral. But the story doesn't end there. Just when it seemed like Tasha's fight for justice had hit a wall, something extraordinary happened. A man in the back of the courtroom, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stood up and identified himself as an investigator from the state's Judicial Oversight Board. He had been there to monitor Judge Grayson's conduct following previous complaints of bias and misconduct. What he had just witnessed was the final straw. In a stunning turn of events, the investigator approached the bench and informed Judge Grayson that he was under investigation. And then, in a moment that felt like something out of a Hollywood script, the judge was asked to step down from the bench, right then and there. As the reality of the situation sank in, the courtroom buzzed with a mix of shock and relief. But for Tasha, the fight was far from over. What would happen next? Would Judge Grayson face real consequences for his actions, or would the system protect one of its own? And what did this mean for Tasha's case? The answers to these questions would unfold in the days and weeks to come. But one thing was clear. This was a story about more than just one woman's fight for justice. It was a story about power, accountability, and the courage it takes to stand up to injustice, even when the odds are stacked against you. So what happened next? Did Tasha finally get the justice she deserved? And what became of Judge Grayson? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. As the investigator led Judge Grayson out of the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. People whispered to each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances. For Tasha, it felt like a small victory, but she knew better than to celebrate just yet. She had been through enough to understand that the wheels of justice often turn slowly, and sometimes not at all. Still, as she watched the judge, a man who had held so much power just moments ago, being escorted out, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. To understand how Tasha ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back a few months. Tasha was a hard-working single mom, juggling 2 jobs to make ends meet for her kids, 8-year-old Jamal and 5-year-old Keisha. Life wasn't easy, but she was determined to give them a better future. One evening, after picking up the kids from daycare, she was pulled over by a police officer for what she was told was a broken taillight. Tasha knew her car was in good condition. She had just had it inspected, but she didn't argue. She handed over her license and registration, assuming it would be a quick stop. But things took a turn when the officer claimed her license was suspended. Tasha was stunned. She had no idea her license was suspended, and she certainly hadn't received any notice about it. The officer wasn't sympathetic. He wrote her a ticket and told her to sort it out in court. That ticket was the start of a nightmare. Tasha spent weeks trying to figure out what had gone wrong. She visited the DMV, only to be told there was a mix-up in their system. Someone with a similar name had accumulated enough violations to get their license suspended, and somehow Tasha's record had been flagged by mistake. She was assured it would be cleared up, but when she showed up to court, the judge, Judge Grayson, wasn't interested in her explanation. He dismissed her claims, telling her she should have been more responsible. Tasha left the courtroom, that day feeling defeated, but she wasn't ready to give up. She filed an appeal, determined to prove her innocence. That's what brought her back to court on the day everything changed. Judge Grayson, on the other hand, had a reputation that preceded him. To the outside world, he was a respected figure in the legal community, a man who had spent years upholding the law. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Over the years, several people, mostly from marginalized communities, had come forward with complaints about his behavior. They spoke of dismissive attitudes, harsh sentences, and comments that crossed the line. But each time, the complaints were brushed aside. Judge Grayson had friends in high places, and it seemed like nothing could touch him. That is, until the day Tasha stood up to him. The investigator who intervened that day was named Marcus Carter. Marcus had been working for the Judicial Oversight Board for over a decade, and he had seen it all. He was no stranger to complaints about judges, but what he witnessed in that courtroom was different. It wasn't just the racist comment, though that was bad enough. It was the way Judge Grayson had treated Tasha from the moment she stepped into the room. Marcus had been quietly observing, taking notes, and when the judge made that comment, he knew he had to act. What he didn't know was that his actions would set off a chain reaction that would shake the entire legal system. As news of what happened in the courtroom began to spread, it didn't take long for the story to go viral. Social media lit up with outrage, and hashtags like "Justice for Tasha" and "Calmer Judge Grayson" started trending. People were demanding answers. How could someone in such a powerful position behave so blatantly? And how many others had been treated unfairly by this judge? The media picked up the story, and soon Tasha found herself at the center of a national conversation about racism and accountability in the justice system. Reporters showed up at her door, asking for interviews, but Tasha was hesitant. She wasn't looking for fame. She just wanted to clear her name and make sure no one else had to go through what she did. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson was facing his own set of challenges. The Judicial Oversight Board launched a full investigation into his conduct, and it wasn't long before more stories started to surface. Former defendants, court staff, and even a few lawyers came forward with their own experiences, painting a picture of a man who had abused his power for years. But Grayson wasn't going down without a fight. He hired a high-profile defense attorney and insisted that he was being unfairly targeted. "This is a witch hunt," he told reporters. "I've always been fair and impartial. This is about politics, not justice." As the investigation deepened, Marcus Carter found himself under pressure from all sides. On one hand, he was determined to see the case through, no matter where it led. On the other, he was aware of the powerful forces at play. Judge Grayson had allies, and they weren't happy about what was happening. Marcus started receiving anonymous threats, warning him to back off. But he refused to be intimidated. He had seen too many cases swept under the rug, and he wasn't about to let this one go. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. What else was out there? And how far were people willing to go to protect their own? For Tasha, the attention was overwhelming. She had never asked for any of this. All she wanted was to move on with her life, but now she was being pulled into a much bigger fight. She started receiving messages of support from people all over the country, but there were also those who criticized her, accusing her of playing the victim. It was a lot to process, but Tasha knew she couldn't back down. She had her kids to think about, and she wanted them to grow up in a world where they wouldn't have to face the same kind of injustice she had. As the days turned into weeks, the tension continued to build. The investigation into Judge Grayson was ongoing, but there were still more questions than answers. What would happen to Tasha's case? Would the charges against her be dropped, or would she have to go through another trial? And what about the other people who had come forward with complaints? Would they finally get the justice they deserved, or would the system protect itself once again? The story was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. For Tasha, Marcus, and everyone else involved, the fight was just beginning. And as the world watched, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. And it was about the courage it takes to stand up and demand change, even when the odds are stacked against you. What would happen next? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. The world was watching and the pressure was on. As the investigation into Judge Grayson gained momentum, the story began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just about one racist comment or one courtroom outburst anymore. It was about a system that had allowed someone like Grayson to wield power unchecked for years. And as more people came forward, the scope of the scandal widened, revealing layers of corruption and bias that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. One of the most shocking revelations came from a former court clerk named Linda Martinez. Linda had worked in Grayson's courtroom for 5 years before quitting abruptly. She had always been too afraid to speak out, but the viral video of Tasha's case gave her the courage to come forward. In a tearful interview, Linda described a toxic environment where Grayson routinely made disparaging remarks about defendants, especially those from minority communities. He would say things like, "These people don't deserve a second chance," or "They'll just end up back here anyway," Linda revealed. It was like he saw them as less than human. Linda also claimed that Grayson had pressured her and other staff members to alter court records to cover up his misconduct. Her testimony was a bombshell, and it added fuel to the growing fire. Meanwhile, Tasha was trying to navigate her newfound role as a symbol of resistance. She hadn't asked for it, but she understood the importance of her story. People were looking to her for hope, and she didn't want to let them down. But the pressure was immense. She was still fighting her own legal battle, and now she was being pulled in a dozen different directions. Activists wanted her to join their campaigns, lawyers offered to represent her pro bono, and strangers reached out with messages of support, and sometimes criticism. Tasha did her best to stay focused, but it wasn't easy. She had her kids to think about, and she couldn't afford to lose sight of what really mattered, clearing her name and making sure no one else had to go through what she did. At the same time, Marcus Carter was digging deeper into Grayson's past. The more he uncovered, the more disturbing it became. He discovered that Grayson had close ties to several powerful figures in the legal and political world, including a state senator who had helped him secure his judgeship. There were also rumors of financial impropriety, luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and unexplained deposits into Grayson's bank account. Marcus knew he was treading on dangerous ground. The people involved had a lot to lose, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But he was determined to see the investigation through, no matter the cost. As the media frenzy grew, so did the public's demand for accountability. Protests erupted outside the courthouse with people chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," And fire Grayson now. The story had struck a nerve, and it wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about a justice system that had failed too many people for too long. Politicians were forced to respond, with some calling for Grayson's immediate removal and others urging caution, saying he deserved a fair hearing. The debate spilled over into the national conversation, with pundits and experts weighing in on what it all meant for the future of the legal system. But not everyone was on Tasha's side. There were those who saw her as a troublemaker, someone who was trying to take down a respected judge for personal gain. Grayson's supporters launched a counter-campaign, painting him as a victim of cancel culture and political correctness. They argued that his comment in the courtroom had been taken out of context and that he was being unfairly targeted. Some even accused Tasha of fabricating the whole thing to get attention. The backlash was harsh, and it took a toll on Tasha. She tried to stay strong, but the constant attacks were wearing her down. Amid all the chaos, Tasha's case was still pending. Her lawyer, a young and ambitious attorney named Rachel Nguyen, was working tirelessly to get the charges dismissed. Rachel believed that the evidence was on their side, but she also knew that the system was rigged against people like Tasha. "We're not just fighting the charges," Rachel told her. "We're fighting an entire system that's designed to keep people like you down." Rachel's words stuck with Tasha, and they gave her the strength to keep going. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but she was ready to fight. As the investigation into Grayson continued, Marcus Carter found himself facing unexpected obstacles. Key witnesses suddenly became reluctant to talk, and important documents seemed to disappear. It was clear that someone was trying to sabotage the case, but Marcus didn't know who or how far they were willing to go. He started to feel like he was being watched, and the threats against him became more frequent and more explicit. But Marcus refused to back down. He had dedicated his career to fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to let a few bullies scare him off. The tension was palpable, and it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Judge Grayson finally be held accountable for his actions? Would Tasha get the justice she deserved? And what about the countless others who had been wronged by the system? The answers to these questions were still unclear. But one thing was certain: the fight was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. And it was about the courage it takes to stand up and demand change, even when the odds are stacked against you. The world was watching, and the pressure was on. What would happen next? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. The fight for justice was just beginning. The days leading up to the climax of the story were a whirlwind of tension, uncertainty, and high-stakes drama. Every new development seemed to raise the stakes even higher, and the pressure was mounting on everyone involved. For Tasha, it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Her case was set to be reheard, and this time, the eyes of the nation were on her. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to see how the drama would unfold. Tasha tried to stay calm, but the anxiety was overwhelming. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. Judge Grayson, meanwhile, was fighting to save his career and his reputation. His legal team had launched a full-scale defense, arguing that the accusations against him were part of a coordinated smear campaign. They pointed to his decades of service on the bench, painting him as a victim of political correctness and cancel culture. But the evidence against him was mounting. More witnesses had come forward, including a former police officer who claimed Grayson had pressured him to falsify evidence in a high-profile case years earlier. The officer, who had since left the force, said he had stayed silent out of fear, but now felt compelled to speak the truth. His testimony was explosive, and it added another layer of complexity to the case. Marcus Carter was in the thick of it all, working around the clock to piece together the evidence. He had never seen a case like this before, and the sheer scale of it was daunting. Every time he thought he was close to uncovering the truth, another obstacle would appear. Documents went missing, witnesses changed their stories, and the threats against him became more brazen. One night, as he was leaving his office, he found his car tires slashed and a note on the windshield that read, "Back off, or else." Marcus knew he was getting too close to something someone didn't want exposed, but instead of scaring him off, it only made him more determined. He couldn't let them win. As the 24-hour countdown began, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Tasha, Rachel, and Marcus huddled together in a small conference room at Rachel's law office, poring over the explosive emails Marcus had uncovered. The messages between Judge Grayson and the local politician were damning, but they needed more than just words on a screen. They needed proof, something concrete that would hold up in court and expose the corruption for what it was. Marcus was determined to get it, but time was running out. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "If they find out we have this, they'll do everything they can to bury it." Just as they were strategizing their next steps, Rachel's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an anonymous tip sent to her office email, a video file with no subject line or message. Rachel hesitated for a moment before opening it. What they saw left them speechless. The video showed Judge Grayson in what appeared to be a private meeting with a well-known defense attorney. The two were discussing a case in hushed tones, and it was clear from the conversation that Grayson had agreed to dismiss charges in exchange for a substantial donation to his re-election campaign. The video was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. It was the smoking gun they needed. But who had sent it and why? The discovery sent shockwaves through the room. "This changes everything," Rachel said, her eyes wide. "If we can verify this video, it's not just Grayson who's going down. It's the whole system." But Marcus was cautious. "We need to be careful," he warned. "If this gets out before we're ready, it could blow up in our faces. We don't know who sent this or what their agenda is." Tasha, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Whoever sent this wants Grayson exposed as much as we do. Maybe they're trying to help." Marcus nodded, but his expression was grim. "Or maybe they're setting us up. Either way, we need to move carefully." As they worked to verify the video, another twist emerged. Tasha received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, a distorted voice on the other end said, "You're playing with fire. Drop the case or you'll regret it." The call lasted only a few seconds, but it left Tasha shaken. She told Rachel and Marcus what had happened, and the mood in the room turned even more serious. "They're getting desperate," Marcus said. "That means we're getting close." But Tasha couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She thought about her kids, about the life she was trying to build for them, and wondered if she was putting them in danger by continuing to fight. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson was growing increasingly paranoid. He had heard whispers about the investigation closing in on him, and he knew his allies were starting to distance themselves. Desperate to protect himself, he reached out to his most powerful connections, calling in favors and making promises. He wasn't sure he could keep, but even he could feel the walls closing in. His once impenetrable network of support was crumbling, and he was running out of options. In a last-ditch effort, he arranged a secret meeting with the politician from the emails, hoping to devise a plan to silence the investigation once and for all. What he didn't know was that Marcus had already put a tail on him, and every move he made was being watched. As the hours ticked by, the pressure mounted on all sides. Rachel filed a motion to introduce the video as evidence in Tasha's case, but the prosecution immediately objected, calling it irrelevant and unverified. Judge Hayes, who had been carefully weighing the arguments, seemed to be at a crossroads. She adjourned the hearing briefly to review the new evidence, leaving everyone in the courtroom on edge. Tasha sat in her seat, her heart pounding as she waited for the judge to return. She knew this could be the moment that decided everything, but she also knew it could backfire spectacularly. Outside the courtroom, Marcus was working furiously to track down the source of the video. He had a hunch that it had come from someone inside Grayson's inner circle, someone who had turned on him. His investigation led him to a former court clerk who had been fired by Grayson months earlier under suspicious circumstances. The clerk, a young woman named Alicia, had been too afraid to come forward publicly but had decided to leak the video anonymously. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she told Marcus when he finally tracked her down. "What he's done, what they've all done, it's wrong. People need to know the truth."